1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Here we enter into some of the most rich language in 1 Peter, from here until the end of the chapter. Just a beautiful reminder of what Christ has done. Peter begins here by speaking of the work of Christ and the example it should have for us. He says, for to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Now, if we remember, this for to this idea relates back to, in the previous video, Peter spoke to those who were suffering unjustly under their masters. And even though they were doing good and doing the right thing, they were suffering. And how that was a good thing in God's eyes, and it glorified him and his purpose. And so now Peter's saying, for to this same thing you're called. Why? Because Christ also suffered for you. Now it's fascinating here in verse 21. How many different ways can he tell us that this is what is expected of us too, right? You've been called to this. Because Christ has done it, you've been called to this. He's left you an example so that you might follow in his steps. And I think we need the repetition of this language because of just how much we try to avoid suffering. We think, surely this couldn't be God's will for my life. Surely he would have different, better things for me than suffering or hardship or loss, things of that nature. But Peter sets the tone right here and tells us, look, because this is what Christ has done in suffering for you, this is what you are to follow. Christ's own life, as we'll see in these verses, sets the entire tone and tenor of our Christian life. We're not told that life's going to be easy in this physical life. It's not going to be without its challenges. No, instead we're told that because Christ has suffered for us, that has set the tone for us, leaving us an example so that we would follow in his steps because we've been called to this. Now, how exactly did Jesus suffer for us? What did he do? What did that look like? Well, I think narrowly his suffering is referring to what we call the passion, the crucifixion. What happened as he approached the cross and as he died on the cross for our sins. Now, he suffered in other ways throughout his life. Absolutely. You think back to Matthew 4 as he's tempted by Satan in the wilderness on an empty stomach and not, at a time when he was physically weak. That was him suffering. But even more so, we could say his peak suffering is clearly as he goes to the cross for us. And that's what Peter begins to describe here in verses 22 and 23. And what he does is he uses allusions, connections with one of the greatest prophecies in Scripture, Isaiah 53. This wonderful prophecy of the coming Messiah. The coming Messiah who would have to suffer and face death in order to save his people from their sins. And so that's what we get here in 22 and 23. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. We'll stop there. This idea of he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. That comes directly from Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, and going on into verse 8 and 9. He had done no violence. There was no deceit in his mouth. Jesus committed no sin. So even as we're called up here to follow him as an example, there's this understanding that, okay, we're not like Jesus. We can't be like Jesus. We can't perfectly suffer and obey God and do it without sinning as Jesus did. No, we're only being called to suffer as he did to glorify God, to obey God and his will. We're not little Jesuses here or anything like that, but his life in some senses sets the example for what we're being called to. So then he gets after this in verse 22. He committed no sin, neither was any deceit found in his mouth. He perfectly told the truth. He perfectly did God's will. He never failed and fell into disobedience. No, he perfectly obeyed God. And then we get into some specific descriptions of maybe what we think about Jesus doing as he approached the cross. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. And these are really significant to think about. When Jesus was reviled, when he was mocked, ridiculed, beaten, scorned as he went to the cross, he didn't do that in return. He didn't chastise back the people that were mocking him. He didn't engage in the games they were playing with. No, this is from Isaiah 53 as well. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. What an incredible truth that as Jesus died on the cross and as he faced such suffering, and you think about the leaders and the guards mocking him the entire time, he did not engage them in the same way. He did not receive the reviling from them. He did not revile in return. And then we see also when he suffered, he did not threaten. Now that's fascinating to think about as well. Jesus underwent the most intense suffering we could ever imagine as he died on the cross, and in doing so faced the wrath of God and also just the physical pain and hurt that death would cause. But he didn't threaten. As people in the crowd threatened him and made demands of him and said they were going to crucify him, he didn't do that in return. No, he suffered according to the will of God. You think back to when he's in the garden in Luke 22, and he says, "Father, if it's your will, let this cup depart from me. Nevertheless, not your will, not my will, but your will be done." He's saying in those moments, he's saying, look, I know what's coming down the pipeline. I'm going to face the very wrath of God, but he doesn't. He doesn't sin against God's will. He doesn't decide to do something else or shirk this suffering or try to get around it or do anything that would cause it to be different. No, he drinks fully the cup of God's wrath. He obeys in the crucible of the suffering that God would have for him in his will. And we see the mindset of Jesus, what he's thinking at this time in this last little bit. This is where we kind of want to end on and think about our own lives. But he continued the whole time entrusting himself to him who judges justly. If you read the gospel narrative, one of the things that should really just jump out is to say, this wasn't fair. This shouldn't have happened. From Jesus, his 2 trials, to how they were treating him on the walk, to the mocking he was receiving as he hung there on the cross. It's just not fair. It shouldn't have happened that way. But you know what Jesus was doing? He was entrusting himself to him who judges justly, to God the Father, knowing that God the Father had the perfect plan that he was choosing to obey and to give his life to. And so, as a result of him committing no sin, he continues trusting God through it all and giving himself over to God, whatever God the Father would choose and would deem necessary. And so this is how our passage relates back to this idea of suffering. Because in those moments of suffering, I think specifically when that's caused by other people, when they may malign you, slander you, do something that really upsets you, that can be so hard. That can really hurt and mess with you in those ways. What can we do in those moments? Well, Peter is making the argument that if we follow Christ's example, what that looks like is trusting God. Continuing to trust God, the only one who judges justly. Because, if we're trusting people, they don't know the truth. They don't know all the facts. They don't know everything of what's going on. But you know who the one who does? God the Father does. You think about it at the cross, Jesus didn't have many friends left standing around. His disciples had departed and fled. Nobody in the crowd was really jumping onto his side. But you know what? He was trusting God because God is the only one who judges justly. He's the only one who knows all things and knows all the facts. And so even as we suffer, my friend, believer, we can take comfort. What comfort we can find in this truth, in entrusting ourselves to God, the one who knows all things and judges all things correctly. So yeah, what we saw in the previous video about slaves being mistreated by their masters, that's not fair. That's not right. That's unjust. That's unjust. What we saw in some of the times how we submit to our government, right? Sometimes the government doesn't treat us fairly, or the government does things that are unjust. But you know what? We can trust God. We can give ourselves, we can entrust ourselves to God each day, knowing He judges justly. And you know what? The truth will be revealed in eternity. And we will be vindicated in that sense, in our suffering, for entrusting ourselves to God. This is what Jesus did. Every day of His life on this earth, in His ministry, He was entrusting Himself to God, to His will, to His purposes. Not His own, not anyone else's. When people didn't agree with Him, or when they mocked Him and caused Him to suffer. No, but He was entrusting Himself to the Father. And so I would just encourage you, the next time you feel like you are in the crucible of suffering, or people are maligning you or mistreating you, or you feel like something's just not fair, or something's unjust, and that's so discouraging, find comfort. Come back to this truth, that you would continue to entrust yourself to the only one who judges justly, God, and give yourself to Him afresh, knowing that your suffering will be temporary, but what will be eternal is knowing this perfect God who judges justly.